They gave a 75-year-old widow a swamp nobody wanted. 5 years later, her dog refused to let them in. The deed looked more like an insult than an inheritance. 3 months after burying her husband, Evelyn Carter sat in a lawyer's office and watched his relatives divide the farmland, rental houses, and equipment among themselves. When her turn came, she received 12 acres of remote Louisiana swamp, nothing else. 5 years later, those same relatives would return to that forgotten land. And her German shepherd would stand in the doorway, as if he knew something she didn't. If you were handed land everyone called worthless, would you keep it or walk away? Let me know below. People are rarely honest when they are giving away something they do not want. They use softer words, opportunity, fresh start, a blessing in disguise. The words sound generous, the smiles look kind. But sometimes the gift tells the truth long before the people do. The truth was sitting on a yellowed piece of paper in front of Evelyn Carter. 12 acres. Wetland property. South end of the parish. No structures listed, no agricultural value assigned, no active utilities, just 12 acres of swamp. The attorney folded his hands on the conference table and offered a sympathetic smile. Your husband wanted everyone taken care of. Evelyn looked down at the deed again. Outside the office window, rain drifted across the parking lot in thin gray sheets. March rain, the kind that seemed determined to stay all day. Across the table sat her late husband's relatives. 3 months earlier, they had stood beside her at the funeral. 3 months earlier, they had cried. 3 months earlier, they had hugged her and promised she would always be family. Now they avoided looking directly at her. That told her everything she needed to know. At 75 years old, Evelyn had spent enough time around people to recognize discomfort when she saw it. Her husband, Walter Carter, had been gone for 93 days. She knew because she counted, not intentionally. The number simply followed her everywhere. 93 mornings without hearing his coffee cup touch the kitchen counter. 93 evenings without his chair creaking beside hers. 93 nights of reaching across an empty mattress before remembering. Some losses become habits before they become memories. Walter had owned farmland, not enormous amounts, but enough. 200 acres of productive pasture, several rental houses near town, equipment, storage buildings, a fishing camp along the river. Things accumulated over a lifetime of work. Evelyn had assumed there would be conversations after his death, discussions, decisions. Instead, everything seemed to happen without her. Documents appeared, meetings occurred, papers were signed. The family moved with quiet efficiency, almost as if they had rehearsed it. Walter's nephew, Curtis, cleared his throat. Nobody wanted you to feel burdened. Evelyn finally lifted her eyes. Burdened. It was an interesting choice of word. Curtis inherited 80 acres. His brother inherited 60. Their sister received rental properties. Equipment had already been divided. The fishing camp belonged to someone else now. Everyone had received something useful, something valuable, something that could generate income, something connected to the life Walter had spent 40 years building. Everyone except Evelyn. The attorney slid the deed slightly closer. The property has potential. Another interesting word. Nobody ever talked about potential when something was already valuable. They only used that word when value required imagination or desperation. Evelyn turned the paper over. Nothing on the back. No hidden explanation. No forgotten paragraph. Just swamp. 12 acres of it. She sat quietly for several seconds. The room seemed strangely loud. The hum of fluorescent lights, rain tapping the windows, someone shifting in a chair, the sound of pages being organized. Small noises suddenly felt enormous. Finally, Evelyn nodded, not because she agreed, not because she was happy, because there was nothing else to do. I see, she said. Curtis immediately smiled with relief. The reaction stung more than she expected. Not because he looked happy, because he looked grateful. She wasn't making things difficult, as though her disappointment would have been inconvenient. The meeting ended 15 minutes later. Everyone stood. Chairs scraped. Hands were shaken. Voices became cheerful again. People talked about weather and traffic, about things that didn't matter. Evelyn gathered her paperwork into a worn leather folder Walter had once carried. Nobody offered to walk her out. Nobody asked where she would go next. Nobody asked if she needed help. The family dispersed into the rainy afternoon, one by one, like people leaving a completed transaction. By the time Evelyn reached her truck, the parking lot was almost empty. Only one figure waited, a large German shepherd sitting patiently beside the passenger door, Duke. His black and tan coat glistened with rainwater. His ears lifted the moment he saw her. He stood and crossed the wet pavement without hesitation, not excited, not frantic, just present, reliable, the way he always was. Evelyn opened the door. Before climbing inside, she rested one hand on his neck. The thick fur felt warm despite the rain. For a moment, neither moved. The silence felt easier beside a dog. Duke leaned gently against her leg. A simple gesture, nothing dramatic, yet somehow it steadied her. "Well," she whispered. Her voice sounded older than she remembered. "I suppose it's just us now." The dog's tail moved once, slowly, as if he understood more than he probably did. Maybe he did. Animals notice things people miss. The drive home took 40 minutes. Low clouds hung over southern Louisiana. Water filled roadside ditches. Egrets stood motionless in flooded fields. Everything looked damp, heavy, gray. By the time she reached the farmhouse, evening shadows had already begun stretching across the pasture. The place felt different now, not because anything had changed, because Walter was gone. Absence changes a place more than presence ever can. She parked beside the barn and sat in the truck for a long time. Duke waited beside her, patient, quiet. Eventually, she stepped out. The porch boards creaked beneath her feet, the same sound they had made for decades. Inside, the house smelled faintly of cedar and coffee. Walter's jacket still hung near the door. His reading glasses still rested on the side table. A half-finished crossword remained folded beside his chair. The ordinary remains of an interrupted life. Evelyn stood in the living room and looked around. Then she understood something. Not all at once. Gradually. Like water rising. The house wasn't really hers anymore. Not in the way it had once been. The papers made that clear. The family made that clear. The future made that clear. For the first time since Walter's funeral, fear slipped quietly beneath her grief. Not panic. Something colder, practical. Where would she go? The answer sat inside her leather folder. 12 acres, south end of the parish. Swamp. 3 weeks later, moving day arrived. Nobody came to help. That surprised her less than it should have. A small trailer carried most of what remained. A bed, kitchen supplies, tools, boxes of photographs. Walter's old fishing tackle. Things too meaningful to leave behind. Things too ordinary for anyone else to want. The morning air smelled of rain-soaked earth. Duke watched from the yard while she loaded the final box. When everything was finished, Evelyn stood on the porch one last time. The pasture stretched beyond the fence line. Cattle grazed in the distance. The barn roof glowed beneath a break in the clouds. She had lived here for 42 years, raised no children, planted thousands of gardens, buried 2 parents, loved 1 husband, and now she was leaving. Not because she wanted to. Because there was nowhere else to stay. A car slowed briefly on the road, then continued on. The world kept moving. It always did. Evelyn locked the front door, placed the key on the porch railing, turned around. Duke was already waiting beside the truck, ready, trusting, as if wherever she went next was exactly where he intended to go to. She opened the driver's door. The leather folder containing the deed rested on the passenger seat. The edge of the paper peeked out. A reminder, a destination, or perhaps a sentence. She couldn't yet tell the difference. The engine started. The truck rolled slowly down the gravel drive. Behind her, The farmhouse disappeared little by little between the oak trees. Ahead waited 12 acres of swamp, a place she had never seen, a place nobody seemed to want, and a future she could not imagine. Beside her, Duke lifted his head and stared through the windshield, watching the road ahead, as if something out there was already waiting for them. Something hidden, something forgotten, something neither of them understood yet. The swamp was still miles away, but it had already begun changing both of their lives. The road narrowed the farther south Evelyn drove. Paved highway became cracked blacktop. Cracked blacktop became gravel. Gravel became two muddy tire tracks cutting through stretches of low country that looked half land and half water. The afternoon sky hung low over Louisiana. Gray clouds drifted above endless stands of cypress. Spanish moss swayed from branches like weathered curtains. Water filled every ditch, every depression, every place where the earth seemed willing to surrender. Evelyn drove with both hands on the wheel. Duke sat upright beside her, watching, always watching. Occasionally he would shift and glance toward the window, his ears twitching at sounds she couldn't hear. The farther they traveled, the fewer houses appeared. Eventually there were none at all, only trees, water, and silence. A silence broken now and then by the distant cry of a heron or the hum of insects rising from the wetlands. When she finally saw the old wooden marker at the roadside, she nearly drove past it. The sign leaned at an angle, weathered almost white by decades of sun and rain. The faded numbers matched the deed folded inside her glove compartment. This was it, 12 acres. Evelyn pulled the truck onto a narrow dirt path. Mud splashed beneath the tires. The road curved between dense palmetto and cypress before opening into a small clearing. She stopped the engine. For several seconds she simply sat there, looking. The property stretched beyond what she could immediately see. Water glimmered between trees. The air looked different somehow, thicker, greener, alive. Duke jumped down first. His paws landed softly on the damp ground. He circled the truck once, then stood still, testing the air. The smell reached Evelyn the moment she stepped out. Wet bark, mud, standing water, leaves slowly returning to earth. It wasn't unpleasant, just unfamiliar, a smell that belonged entirely to this place. The clearing itself sat on slightly higher ground, not much, maybe a few feet, enough to stay mostly dry. Someone long ago had parked trailers here. The rusted remains of utility poles still stood near the edge of the trees. A broken concrete slab sat partially buried beneath weeds, evidence that people had once tried living here and eventually stopped. The small trailer she'd hired to move her belongings arrived an hour later. The driver helped unload without saying much. Most people in rural Louisiana understood when someone wanted privacy. By sunset, her bed sat inside a worn but usable mobile home that had come with the property. The structure wasn't mentioned in the deed, probably because nobody considered it worth mentioning. The roof sagged slightly. Several windows needed repair. The paint had long surrendered to the weather. Still, it was shelter. That first evening, Evelyn sat on the small wooden steps outside the trailer. Duke lay nearby. The sun disappeared behind the cypress trees. Almost immediately, the swamp came alive. Frogs began calling from every direction. Not one frog, thousands. Different pitches, different rhythms, an entire orchestra hidden in the darkness. Fireflies appeared among the reeds, small floating lights moving through the gathering night. The scene should have felt beautiful. Instead, it felt strange, like stepping into someone else's dream. She missed Walter more that evening than she had in weeks. Not because anything specific reminded her of him, because he wasn't there to see it. The thought arrived quietly, then settled beside her, a familiar companion. She remained outside until darkness covered the wetlands completely. Then she went inside. Duke followed. The first night passed slowly. Every sound seemed unfamiliar. Branches brushing the roof, water moving somewhere beyond the trees, animals calling in the distance. At one point, she woke convinced someone was walking outside. When she listened carefully, she realized it was only rain dripping from cypress branches. By morning, she felt exhausted, but determined. She made coffee, fed Duke, and began exploring. The property looked different in daylight. More open, more complicated. Several shallow channels wound through the wetlands. Clusters of cypress rose from standing water. Patches of higher ground appeared unexpectedly among the marsh. Birds moved everywhere. White egrets, blue herons, wood ducks. Life seemed to exist in every direction. Duke stayed close during the first hour, sometimes ahead, sometimes beside her, never far away. They followed a narrow game trail through waist-high grass. The ground remained firm enough for walking, mostly. Occasionally, Evelyn's boots sank ankle-deep into mud. Each time, she muttered under her breath and kept moving. The farther they traveled, the more isolated everything felt. The trailer vanished behind trees. The road disappeared. Only swamp remained. Around midday, they reached the western section of the property. The vegetation changed there. Palmetto grew thicker. Vines tangled through low branches. The sunlight struggled to reach the ground. Duke suddenly stopped. Evelyn took several more steps before realizing he wasn't beside her. She turned. The gerbschmer stood motionless. Not frightened. Not aggressive. Still. His ears pointed forward, his eyes fixed on something ahead. Duke? He didn't move. Evelyn followed his gaze. At first, she saw nothing. Then she noticed a narrow opening hidden behind thick palmetto, a gap barely visible from where she stood. Beyond it sat a structure, old, weathered, partially swallowed by the swamp, an abandoned shack. The roof sagged inward. One wall leaned noticeably. Vines crawled across the boards. It looked as though nobody had touched it in decades. Evelyn stepped toward it. Duke immediately shifted. Not forward, backward. One step, then another. His body remained rigid, alert, watching. The behavior caught her attention instantly. This wasn't like him. Duke had spent years exploring woods, fields, riverbanks, and hunting camps with Walter. Nothing usually bothered him. Yet now he seemed unwilling to go closer. "Come on," she gestured lightly. The dog remained where he was. Evelyn frowned. She moved another few feet toward the shack. Duke let out a low breath. Not a growl, something quieter. A warning. The sound barely rose above the insects. She stopped. For a moment the swamp seemed strangely silent. Even the frogs felt distant. The old shack sat hidden among shadows. Waiting. The structure itself looked harmless. Just another forgotten building slowly returning to nature. Still, something about Duke's reaction unsettled her. The German shepherd had never been dramatic. If anything, he was cautious, measured. He paid attention before reacting. That was one of the reasons Walter had trusted him so completely. Evelyn looked from the dog to the shack and back again. Finally, she shrugged. All right. She wasn't eager to fight through vines anyway. The place looked ready to collapse. Probably an old hunting shelter. Nothing more. Yet as they turned back toward the trailer, she glanced over her shoulder one last time. The shack remained partially hidden behind the brush, a dark shape among darker shadows. Easy to overlook, easy to forget. Except Duke didn't forget. The entire walk home he remained unusually quiet, and later that evening, while Evelyn stood on the porch, watching the sunset reflect across the water, she noticed something. The dog wasn't looking at the swamp. He wasn't watching birds or listening to frogs. His attention remained fixed toward the distant section of trees where the abandoned shack stood, hidden, as though some part of him was still there. Watching, waiting, and for the first time since arriving, Evelyn found herself wondering whether the property held more than mud and water. The thought stayed with her long after darkness settled over the wetlands. Long after the frogs began singing again. Long after Duke finally lay down beside the porch steps. Somewhere beyond the trees sat an abandoned shack, and for reasons she could not explain, her dog wanted nothing to do with it. Yet he couldn't stop watching it either. For the next several days, Evelyn tried not to think about the abandoned shack. There were more immediate problems. The trailer leaked whenever it rained. The small generator failed twice during the first week. The kitchen sink drained so slowly it seemed to consider each drop before letting it pass. And the swamp itself had 1,000 ways of reminding her that she was no longer living on a dry cattle farm. Every morning brought a new challenge. One day it was mud. The next day it was mosquitoes. The day after that it was discovering that part of the path leading to her trailer disappeared, underwater whenever the creek rose. The swamp seemed determined to test her, and at 75, Evelyn wasn't entirely sure she was prepared for the examination. Still, she got up every morning, made coffee, fed Duke, and kept going. The routine helped. Walter had always believed routine could carry a person through almost anything. Grief, illness, bad weather, hard years. Just keep moving, he used to say. Some days that's enough. So Evelyn moved. She repaired loose boards beneath the trailer. She cleared brush around the clearing. She organized supplies. She built simple shelves inside the trailer, using scrap lumber she found beneath an old tarp. The work wasn't glamorous, but it filled the hours, and hours were dangerous when left empty, especially after loss. Summer arrived slowly. The wetlands changed with the season. The water remained, but everything else seemed to grow. Grass rose waist-high. Vines climbed trees. Wildflowers appeared along the higher ground. The air itself felt heavier, warmer, thicker. Sometimes the humidity settled over the swamp, like a blanket that refused to lift. On those afternoons, even Duke preferred shade. He would stretch beneath the trailer, or beneath the cypress trees, watching while Evelyn worked. Never far away, never out of sight. One morning, nearly 2 months after arriving, Evelyn decided to explore the eastern edge of the property. She packed water, a notebook, a small hand shovel. Nothing complicated. Just enough to learn more about the land she now owned. Duke followed as usual. The swamp greeted them with its familiar sounds. Dragonflies buzzed over standing water. Turtles slipped from logs into narrow channels. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker hammered at a tree trunk. The place no longer felt entirely foreign. Not comfortable yet, but less strange. That morning, they discovered something important. A ridge. Not large, perhaps only 3 or 4 feet higher than the surrounding wetlands. Yet the difference mattered. The soil remained relatively dry. Oak trees grew there instead of cypress. The ground felt solid beneath her boots. Evelyn stood beneath the shade and looked around. For the first time since arriving, she could imagine possibilities. A garden, storage, maybe even a workshop someday. The thought surprised her, because until that moment, she had been focused only on surviving. Now she found herself thinking about living. Duke wandered ahead, sniffing among the trees. For several minutes, he seemed completely relaxed. Then suddenly he stopped. His head lifted. His ears turned west, toward the same section of swamp where the abandoned shack sat hidden. Evelyn followed his gaze. The trees concealed everything from view. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Duke remained alert for several seconds before finally relaxing again. It happened often after that. Not every day, but enough that she noticed. Sometimes while fishing, sometimes while repairing fences, sometimes while drinking coffee on the trailer steps. The dog would pause, listen, look toward the western section, then continue whatever he had been doing, as though checking on something. The behavior became part of life, strange, but familiar, like the frogs or the mist rising from the water at dawn. The months passed. The swamp revealed itself slowly, patiently. Evelyn learned where fish gathered beneath fallen trees. She learned which paths flooded after heavy rain. She learned where blackberries grew along the edges of the higher ground. And she learned that appearances could be deceptive. What looked like open water often hid firm footing beneath. What appeared solid could swallow a boot without warning. The swamp demanded attention. rewarded observation, punished assumptions. One afternoon, a thunderstorm rolled across the parish, the kind that arrived suddenly. Dark clouds, sharp wind, sheets of rain. Evelyn watched from the trailer window as water hammered the wetlands. The storm lasted less than an hour. The flooding remained for days. Large sections of the property disappeared beneath rising water. The road became nearly impassable. Several times she wondered whether she had made a terrible mistake. The doubts usually arrived after dark, when the trailer felt small, when rain tapped against the roof, when Walter's side of the bed remained empty. Those were the hardest hours, not because of the swamp, because of loneliness. The two often arrived together. One evening she found herself sitting on the trailer steps long after sunset. A lantern glowed beside her. Duke rested nearby. The frogs had begun their nightly chorus. The water reflected scattered stars. Everything seemed peaceful, yet a heaviness remained inside her, a quiet ache she couldn't quite escape. She reached down and absently scratched behind Duke's ears. The German shepherd immediately leaned against her leg, not demanding attention, offering presence. The simple weight of him helped, it always did. "You would have liked him, Walter." The words escaped before she realized she had spoken them aloud. Duke glanced up, his brown eyes reflecting lantern light. For a moment she laughed softly, the first real laugh she'd managed in weeks. It felt strange, but welcome. The seasons continued turning. Summer gave way to autumn. The oppressive heat softened. Migrating birds began appearing across the wetlands, thousands of them. Some mornings Evelyn would step outside and find entire flocks resting on the water. The sight never failed to stop her. Beauty existed here, unexpected beauty, the kind nobody mentioned when they talked about swamps. One Saturday she drove into town for supplies. The cashier at the feed store recognized her. "You're the lady living out on the old wetland tract." Evelyn smiled. "I suppose I am." The woman shook her head. "I didn't think anybody would ever move out there." Neither did Evelyn, not 6 months earlier. Yet here she was. She purchased fencing supplies, seed packets, and feed for a few chickens she planned to buy in the spring. Small purchases, future purchases, the kind people make when they expect to stay somewhere. Driving home, she realized something. For the first time since Walter died, she had spent an entire day without thinking about leaving. The thought surprised her, because she hadn't noticed the change happening. It had arrived gradually, like the seasons, like healing, not all at once. The swamp wasn't home, not yet, but it no longer felt like exile. When she reached the property that evening, Duke greeted her from the clearing. His tail wagged, his ears perked forward, happy to see her. She unloaded supplies while the sun drifted lower across the wetlands. The sky turned gold, then orange, then deep purple. As darkness approached, Duke suddenly paused. The familiar pause, head up, ears forward, eyes fixed toward the western section of the property, toward the hidden shack. Evelyn stopped working, waited. The dog stood motionless, watching, listening. The moment lasted perhaps 20 seconds. Then it passed. Duke relaxed and returned to her side. Nothing happened, no movement, no sound, no explanation. Yet the feeling lingered, the same feeling she'd experienced during their first exploration. A faint sense that some small part of the swamp remained unknown, not dangerous, not necessarily, simply unexplained. And as the first year unfolded around her, Evelyn found herself learning the language of the wetlands. The rise and fall of water, the movement of birds, the habits of fish, the rhythm of storms, the meaning of silence. Everything seemed to tell a story. Everything except the abandoned shack, that remained quiet, hidden, watching from behind the trees. And somehow, despite all the months that had passed, Duke still refused to go near it. The second spring arrived quietly. One morning the cypress branches were bare enough to see through. A few weeks later they carried fresh green leaves. The swamp changed the way it always did, slowly, patiently, as though time moved differently there. By then, Evelyn had settled into a rhythm. Not comfort, exactly, but familiarity. She knew which paths stayed dry after rain. She knew where to find fish when the water temperature changed. She knew which birds arrived first in the morning, and which called after sunset. The property no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a place she was learning, and every place, she believed, had its own language. The trouble was that some parts of the swamp still seemed unwilling to speak, especially the western section, especially the area near the abandoned shack. One afternoon, a powerful storm rolled across the parish. The weather report had warned about heavy winds. It turned out to be right. The storm arrived shortly after lunch. Rain hammered the trailer roof. Tree branches whipped back and forth. The sky darkened until afternoon looked like evening. Duke spent most of the storm stretched beside Evelyn's chair, calm, alert, listening. By dawn the next morning, the worst had passed. The swamp looked battered. Broken branches floated through the channels. Leaves covered the paths. Several trees had fallen during the night. Evelyn grabbed work gloves, a folding saw, and a wheelbarrow. There was cleanup to do. The air smelled fresh after the storm. Wet bark, mud, fresh cut wood. The kind of scent that arrives only after heavy rain. Duke followed her as she worked. Together they moved through the property, one fallen branch at a time, one path at a time. By mid-morning they reached an area she rarely visited, the western side, not close to the shack itself, but closer than usual. The storm had knocked down part of a large oak. The fallen trunk blocked one of the game trails. Evelyn began clearing smaller limbs first. That was when she noticed something strange. A row of weathered wooden posts sticking out of the marsh grass. At first, she assumed they were fence posts, old ones, forgotten ones. But when she looked closer, the spacing seemed wrong. Too regular, too deliberate. She walked farther along the line. Another post appeared, then another, then another. The row continued beneath the reeds, straight as an arrow. Duke stayed beside her, watching quietly. Evelyn brushed away tangled grass near one of the posts. The wood was ancient, gray with age, almost fossilized. Whatever it had once supported had disappeared long ago, but the alignment remained. She followed the line another 30 yards. Eventually it ended near a shallow channel. There she found something else. Brick. Not one brick, several, half buried in mud, their edges worn smooth by decades of weather. She crouched and picked one up. Heavy, old, handmade by the look of it. Certainly older than anything she had brought to the property. She turned it over in her hands. A question formed immediately. Why would there be bricks in the middle of a swamp? That afternoon, she filled a small bucket with the pieces she found. Broken brick, rusted metal fragments, a square iron bolt, nothing valuable, nothing useful. Yet none of it belonged naturally in the wetlands. Somebody had once built something there. The question lingered in her mind all week. By Saturday, she decided to ask around. The nearest town sat less than 20 minutes away. A small Louisiana community, where everybody seemed to know everybody else's business. Evelyn stopped first at the hardware store, then the feed store, then a diner near the courthouse. She mentioned the posts, the bricks, the old iron fragments. Most people simply shrugged. A few offered guesses. An old fishing camp, a logging operation, maybe an abandoned homestead. Nobody seemed certain. The answers felt incomplete, like pieces from different puzzles. Late that afternoon, while paying for a bag of chicken feed, Evelyn mentioned the discovery to the store owner. The woman nodded toward an elderly man sitting near the front window. "You might ask Mr. Delacroix." Evelyn looked over. The man appeared to be in his 80s, thin, weathered. The kind of face shaped by decades outdoors. What did he do? County surveyor for 40 years, the woman smiled. If anybody remembers old property lines, it's him. A few minutes later, Evelyn carried her coffee to the man's table. He listened without interruption. No hurry, no impatience, just quiet attention. When she finished describing the posts and bricks, He stared out the window for several moments, thinking. Then he nodded slowly. I haven't heard anyone mention that area in years. You know what it was? Not exactly. His voice carried the slow rhythm of someone who measured words carefully. But I remember stories that immediately caught her attention. What kind of stories? The old surveyor leaned back. Before my time. Before my father's time, even. Outside, a truck rolled past on the street. The sound faded. The diner grew quiet again. There used to be people living out there. Evelyn blinked. In the swamp? He nodded. Not exactly a town, more of a settlement. The word hung between them. Settlement. Somehow it sounded larger than she expected. What happened to it? The old man shrugged. No one knows for certain. He sipped his coffee. There was flooding, maybe disease, maybe economic trouble. Depends who you ask. You've seen records? A few references. He smiled faintly. Mostly stories. The answer should have disappointed her. Instead, it deepened her curiosity. A forgotten settlement, buried somewhere beneath the wetlands. The possibility stayed with her throughout the drive home. As evening settled across the swamp, she found herself looking at the land differently. Not simply as property, not simply as survival, but as a place where people had once lived, worked, raised families, made plans, then disappeared. The idea felt strangely haunting. After sunset, she sat on the trailer steps with Duke beside her. The frogs had begun singing again. Mist drifted above the water. The western section of the property remained hidden behind darkness. Invisible, yet somehow present. Evelyn looked toward it, toward the distant shack, toward the line of ancient posts, toward the fragments of brick buried beneath reeds. Pieces of a story, pieces that didn't quite fit together, not yet. Duke lifted his head. His gaze followed hers. For a moment, both of them stared toward the same patch of darkness. The dog remained silent. So did Evelyn. Yet neither looked away immediately, because for the first time since arriving at the swamp, she had the feeling that the property was hiding something. Not treasure, not danger, something older. A forgotten chapter of somebody else's life. And somewhere beneath the reeds and standing water, traces of that forgotten world were still waiting to be found. The thought stayed with Evelyn through the rest of the year. Not as an obsession, more like a quiet companion. Something she carried while living the ordinary days that made up her life. The swamp, meanwhile, continued revealing itself. Little by little, season by season. The third year began with a winter so mild that green never completely disappeared from the wetlands. The cypress trees shed their needles. The mornings arrived wrapped in fog, and Duke remained exactly as he always had been. Close, watchful, steady. Evelyn had stopped measuring her life by what she had lost. There was too much work to do for that. Instead, she measured it by small victories, a repaired fence, a successful harvest, a dry roof after a storm, a good day, then another, then another. The ridge she had discovered during her first year became the center of everything. It wasn't large, only a few acres of higher ground rising above the surrounding wetlands, but it was enough. The soil stayed relatively dry. Sunlight reached it for most of the day. And after months of experimenting, Evelyn realized vegetables grew surprisingly well there, especially in raised beds. The first garden was modest. Tomatoes, peppers, beans, a few rows of squash, nothing ambitious. She built the beds herself using reclaimed lumber and fallen cedar posts. When the first harvest arrived, she stood among the plants, holding a tomato nearly the size of her fist. For a long moment, she simply stared at it. Then she laughed. The sound startled a nearby heron into flight. Duke lifted his head from the shade and watched her as though wondering what was so amusing. That evening, she sliced the tomato for supper. It tasted better than anything she had grown in years. Maybe because she had earned it. Maybe because it represented something more than food. Proof. Proof that life could still move forward. The following season, she doubled the garden. The season after that, she doubled it again. Word slowly spread through the parish. The woman living out on the old swamp tract grew unusually good produce. People began stopping by. At first, only a few: a retired schoolteacher, a fisherman from town, a young couple looking for fresh vegetables. Then more. Some arrived out of curiosity. Others came because somebody had recommended her tomatoes, or her honey, or the blackberry preserves she started making from wild berries gathered along the edge of the wetlands. Most stayed longer than they planned. The swamp had a way of surprising people. Visitors expected mud, mosquitoes, isolation. Instead, they found gardens, flowers, birdsong, a quiet beauty that photographs never seemed able to capture. By her 4th year, Evelyn had placed a simple wooden sign beside the road. Carters produce fresh vegetables, honey. Preserves, nothing fancy, just enough. Every Saturday morning she arranged baskets beneath a covered shelter she built near the clearing. Tomatoes glowed red in the sunlight. Jars of honey caught golden reflections. Fresh peppers sat beside cucumbers and squash. The business wasn't large. It didn't need to be, but it provided income, and perhaps more importantly, purpose. The customers came regularly now. Some returned every week. Others simply enjoyed talking. Evelyn found herself learning their stories: a widower raising grandchildren, a nurse working long shifts, a retired mechanic who always bought extra honey because his wife loved it in her tea. Life, somehow, had begun growing around her again. Not the life she once imagined, a different one, yet meaningful all the same. One afternoon, a customer looked across the wetlands and shook his head. "I still can't believe anybody managed to make something out of this place." The comment wasn't intended as an insult. Still, Evelyn smiled to herself after he left, because she remembered thinking exactly the same thing, back when she first arrived, back when the property looked like a punishment. The seasons kept turning. Spring brought wildflowers. Summer brought dragonflies. Autumn painted the marsh grasses gold. Winter wrapped the wetlands in silver fog. Through it all, Duke remained her shadow. Age had begun touching him. His muzzle carried more gray now. He rose a little slower in the mornings, but his instincts remained sharp, especially where the western section of the property was concerned. Every visitor received the same welcome: a cautious sniff, a wagging tail. Then acceptance. Every visitor except near the abandoned shack. That never changed, not once. The pattern became so familiar Evelyn could predict it. Someone would arrive. Duke would greet them. Everything would seem normal. Then, if their walk happened to drift too far west, the dog would quietly move ahead, positioning himself between the visitor and the distant trees. Not aggressive, not threatening, simply firm, as though drawing an invisible boundary. Most people never noticed. Evelyn did. One Saturday, shortly after closing the produce stand, she watched a local teenager wander toward the western side while admiring the wetlands. Duke immediately stood. The German shepherd crossed the clearing and stopped several yards ahead of the boy. His posture remained relaxed, yet unmistakably purposeful. The teenager hesitated, then turned back toward the gardens. The moment passed, but Evelyn filed it away. Another small piece of a puzzle she still couldn't solve. Later that evening, she walked with Duke along one of the elevated trails near sunset. The sky reflected across the water in streaks of orange and gold. Tree frogs had already begun calling. A gentle breeze carried the smell of wet earth and flowering vines. The property looked beautiful, more beautiful than she ever would have believed possible 5 years earlier. She stopped near the ridge and looked out across the wetlands. The gardens stretched behind her. The produce shelter stood near the road. A small apiary buzzed softly beneath a stand of trees. The swamp no longer resembled the forgotten tract she'd inherited. It felt alive, productive, loved. Duke stood beside her. Then, almost instinctively, his attention shifted west, toward the hidden shack, toward the distant section concealed by palmetto and cypress. His ears lifted. His body grew still, watching. The familiar behavior should have felt ordinary by now. Instead, it made Evelyn curious all over again. 5 years. 5 years of the same reaction. 5 years of the same silent warning. The abandoned structure remained untouched, or so she believed. No lights, no movement, no signs of activity. Just a decaying building slowly disappearing into the swamp. Yet Duke continued treating it differently than any other place on the property. As darkness settled over the wetlands, Evelyn found herself staring toward the trees. The mystery felt farther away than ever, and somehow closer, because everything else had changed. The gardens had grown, the business had grown, her confidence had grown. Only one thing remained exactly as it had been during that first week. An old shack hidden behind the trees, and a German shepherd who refused to stop watching it. The swamp had transformed from burden into opportunity. Visitors saw that now. Customers saw it. Neighbors saw it. Even Evelyn saw it. But somewhere beyond the gardens and the produce stand, beyond the trails and the fishing channels, one unanswered question remained waiting in the shadows. And Duke, as always, seemed unwilling to forget it. The change happened gradually, so gradually that Evelyn almost missed it. At first, she blamed age. Duke was nearly 11 now. For a German shepherd, that was no small thing. His muzzle had turned silver. His movements had slowed. Some mornings he stretched longer before standing. Some afternoons he preferred resting in the shade, instead of following her everywhere. Yet one habit remained untouched by time: the western section of the property. If anything, his attention toward it had grown stronger. The summer heat settled heavily across the wetlands. Days arrived bright and humid. The air shimmered above the standing water. Dragonflies hovered over the channels. The gardens flourished. Business remained steady. From the outside, life seemed peaceful. But Duke had begun doing something new. Every evening, shortly before sunset, he disappeared. Not for long. 10 minutes. 20 at most. Then he returned. At first, Evelyn assumed he was following deer trails or checking familiar paths. The property was large enough to hide 100 small routines. Still, she noticed, mostly because the timing rarely changed. Just before sunset, every evening, the dog would leave and return. One August evening, curiosity finally overcame her. She waited until Duke started toward the western side. Then she followed, quietly, keeping her distance. The trail wound through marsh grass and clusters of cypress. Golden sunlight filtered through hanging moss. Insects buzzed above the water. Ahead, Duke moved with surprising purpose. Not wandering, not exploring, heading somewhere. The realization made Evelyn uneasy. She had lived on the property for 5 years. Yet suddenly she felt like a visitor following someone who knew more than she did. The dog eventually stopped near a cluster of trees overlooking the abandoned section. Not beside the shack itself, a good distance away, partially hidden. From there, he simply sat, watching. The shack remained almost invisible behind dense vegetation. Its roof sagged lower than she remembered. Vines covered most of the walls. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared unusual. Yet Duke remained focused, his attention fixed completely on the structure. 5 minutes passed, then 10. Finally, the dog stood and started back toward home, as if completing a task, as if confirming something. Evelyn said nothing, but the behavior troubled her. The following evening he repeated it, and the evening after that, always the same, always watching. A week later, something happened that changed everything. A storm had passed through during the night. Not severe, just enough rain to soften the ground. The next morning, Evelyn headed toward the western trail to inspect for damage. Duke accompanied her. The air smelled fresh. Mud squished beneath her boots. Water dripped from leaves overhead. The swamp seemed unusually quiet. Halfway down the trail, Duke suddenly stopped. His posture changed instantly. Alert, focused. Evelyn felt it before she understood it. Something was different. The dog lowered his nose toward the ground, then moved forward slowly. Following a scent, she watched him carefully. The trail curved toward the abandoned section, toward the place he usually avoided. Yet now he seemed interested in something else, something recent. Several yards ahead, Evelyn noticed impressions in the mud, footprints. She froze. At first she thought they might be her own, but they weren't. The tread pattern looked unfamiliar. The prints appeared fresh, made after the storm. Someone had been there, recently, very recently. The realization sent a chill through her. The property sat far from any road, far from any neighbor. Nobody should have been wandering through the western section. At least not that she knew of. She crouched beside the tracks. The impressions headed toward the old shack, then disappeared beneath thicker vegetation. Duke remained motionless, watching, listening. For several moments neither moved. The swamp itself seemed to hold its breath. Eventually Evelyn stood. Maybe a hunter. The explanation sounded reasonable. Yet something about it felt wrong. Hunting season hadn't started, and most hunters preferred easier ground. The footprints stayed with her all day. That evening she returned, this time carrying a flashlight. The western trail looked different after dark, more isolated, more mysterious. The beam illuminated patches of reeds and water. Reflections shimmered between trees. Duke stayed close. As they approached the abandoned area, another detail emerged. A rusted chain hanging near the shack's doorway. She had noticed it years ago. The chain once secured the entrance. Now it hung loose. One section appeared broken. Evelyn frowned. She couldn't remember whether it had always looked that way. The uncertainty bothered her. Nearby vegetation had also been disturbed. Several vines appeared freshly snapped, brush bent aside. Not dramatically, just enough to suggest recent movement. Someone had definitely been there. The question was why. She considered approaching the shack. The thought lingered. Yet something stopped her. Perhaps caution, perhaps common sense. The structure looked unstable. The floor might collapse, the roof might fall. Night wasn't the time for exploration, not alone, not at 75. So she turned back, but her mind refused to settle. The next several weeks brought more signs, subtle ones, easy to overlook. Freshly broken branches, a faint path through vegetation, the occasional footprint after rain. Never enough evidence to explain anything, always enough to raise questions. Duke noticed every time. His behavior changed noticeably. He became more protective, more attentive. When customers visited the produce stand, he remained friendly as always. But once they left, he often positioned himself where he could see the western section. Watching, waiting. The habit became almost constant. One evening, Evelyn sat on the porch as dusk settled across the wetlands. The sky glowed deep orange behind the cypress trees. Tree frogs began their nightly chorus. A breeze stirred the tall grass. Duke lay beside her chair, at least for a while. Then suddenly he stood, without a sound, without hesitation. His gaze locked toward the distant trees, the same hidden section. But something felt different. His body had grown tense, not frightened, alert, extremely alert. Evelyn followed his line of sight. For several seconds she saw nothing. Then movement, a shadow, far away. Gone almost immediately. Perhaps a deer, perhaps not. The distance made certainty impossible. Yet Duke remained standing long after the movement disappeared. The dog's eyes never left the western section. That night sleep came slowly. The swamp no longer felt entirely predictable. For years the mystery had belonged to the past. Forgotten settlements, ancient posts, buried bricks, old stories. Now it felt present, current, alive. Somebody had entered that area. Somebody had searched around the shack. The mystery was no longer historical. It was happening now, and somehow Duke had sensed the change before she did. The following evening, just before sunset, Evelyn watched him begin his usual patrol toward the western trail. This time, she didn't stop him. She simply sat on the porch and observed. The dog disappeared among the trees. Minutes later, the wetlands fell quiet, unusually quiet. Even the frogs seemed subdued. The feeling lasted only a moment. Then the normal sounds returned. Yet the sensation remained. The unsettling awareness that something hidden was moving beneath the surface of events. Something she didn't understand. Something connected to the shack. Something connected to the footprints. And whatever it was, Duke seemed determined not to lose sight of it. September arrived with cooler mornings. The worst of the summer heat finally loosened its grip on the wetlands. Mist drifted across the channels at dawn. The gardens remained productive. Customers still stopped by every Saturday. From the outside, life appeared steady, predictable, good. Yet Evelyn couldn't shake the feeling that something was moving beneath the surface. The footprints had stopped appearing, at least visibly. No fresh tracks, no new disturbances, no obvious signs that anyone had returned. But that almost made it worse. The absence felt deliberate, as if whoever had been there knew enough to avoid leaving evidence. She mentioned it once to a neighbor named Harold Pierce, a retired game warden who occasionally bought honey from her stand. "You ever see anybody out there?" she asked. Harold shook his head. "Not on purpose." "What does that mean?" He smiled faintly. "It means nobody goes looking for swampland unless they have a reason." The answer lingered with her long after he left. A reason. Who would have a reason, and why now? 5 years had passed since she arrived. 5 years. Long enough for most people to forget the property existed. Long enough for the family who gave it away to move on. Or so she thought. The first sign arrived on a Tuesday afternoon. A dark SUV rolled slowly down the dirt road leading to her property. Vehicles were nothing unusual. Customers occasionally got lost. Delivery drivers sometimes confused addresses. But this vehicle didn't stop at the produce stand. Instead, it continued toward the trailer, toward her. Duke noticed immediately. He stood before the vehicle, even reached the clearing. His ears lifted, his body stiffened. The SUV stopped. The driver's door opened, and Evelyn felt her stomach tighten. She recognized the man immediately. Curtis, Walter's nephew. 5 years older, a little heavier, but unmistakably Curtis. The same Curtis who had sat across the estate table. The same Curtis who had smiled when she accepted 12 acres of swamp. For several seconds neither moved. Then Curtis offered a smile. "Well, look at this place." Evelyn remained standing beside the garden fence. The distance between them felt appropriate. "What are you doing here?" Curtis laughed lightly, as though the question surprised him. "Can't a man visit family?" The word sounded strange coming from him. 5 years earlier nobody had used it. Not when she was packing boxes. Not when she was leaving the farmhouse. Not once. Yet now it appeared easily enough. Duke moved closer, not threatening, not aggressive. Simply closer, Curtis noticed. "I remember him. He's gotten older. Haven't we all?" The conversation felt awkward, forced. Curtis spent 20 minutes walking around the property, admiring the gardens, complimenting the produce stand, asking questions. Too many questions. How many acres were cleared? How much produce did she sell? Did many people visit? Was the property profitable? Each question sounded casual, yet together they formed a pattern. When he finally left, Evelyn felt relieved. Not happy, relieved. That evening, she sat on the porch thinking about the visit. Duke lay nearby, watching the road long after the vehicle disappeared. 3 days later, another visitor arrived. This time it was Curtis's sister, Denise. She brought a pie, homemade, at least supposedly homemade. She talked about old memories, asked about Evelyn's health, mentioned family members she hadn't spoken to in years. The conversation felt strangely rehearsed, like somebody following a script. Duke remained polite, but distant. He never approached Denise, never accepted the treats she offered, never relaxed completely. The behavior bothered Evelyn more than she cared to admit. Over the next month, the visits continued. Not frequent, but regular. One relative, then another, then another. Always friendly, always curious, always interested in the property. Nobody mentioned the swamp directly. Nobody mentioned ownership. Nobody mentioned the estate. Yet the questions kept circling back to the land, the produce, the visitors, the improvements. One October morning, Harold stopped by for honey. After listening to Evelyn describe the recent visits, he frowned. Funny timing. What do you mean? Everybody's struggling right now. He adjusted his hat. Investments went south. Property values dropped. Couple businesses closed. Evelyn looked at him. You know something about Walter's family? Small parish. Harold shrugged. People talk. The statement explained more than he realized. Suddenly pieces began fitting together. The unexpected friendliness, the renewed interest, the repeated visits. None of it felt accidental anymore. Something had changed, and it wasn't affection. Late one afternoon, nearly a week later, a convoy of 2 vehicles appeared on the road. Evelyn immediately recognized them. Curtis, Denise, and 2 other relatives she hadn't seen in years. The timing felt different this time. More deliberate, more organized. The vehicles parked near the clearing. Doors opened. People emerged smiling, carrying boxes of pastries and bottled drinks, trying far too hard. Evelyn watched from the porch. Duke sat beside her, silent still. The relatives approached together. The scene felt oddly familiar. Like another meeting, another transaction. Only this time the setting was different. The swamp stretched behind her. The gardens glowed beneath the afternoon sun. Everything she had built stood visible around them. Curtis led the group. We thought we'd spend the afternoon catching up. Nobody answered immediately. The air felt heavy. The wetlands unusually quiet. Then something happened. The relatives started toward the porch, and Duke stood. Not suddenly, not violently, calmly, deliberately. The aging German shepherd stepped forward and positioned himself directly in front of the porch steps. Between Evelyn and the approaching group, he didn't bark, didn't growl, didn't bare his teeth. He simply stood there, watching. His posture said everything. The movement stopped the conversation instantly. Curtis laughed nervously. What's gotten into him? Evelyn didn't answer, because she had never seen Duke behave like that. Not once. Not in 11 years. The dog remained perfectly still, blocking the path, refusing to move. Denise took a cautious step forward. Duke stepped forward too. Just one pace, nothing threatening, yet unmistakably firm. No farther. The message couldn't have been clearer. An uncomfortable silence settled across the clearing. The relatives exchanged glances, confused, embarrassed, perhaps even unsettled, because dogs often notice things people miss. And right now Duke seemed absolutely certain about something. Evelyn looked down at him. The German shepherd never took his eyes off the group, not for a second. His body remained tense, focused, protective. Then a realization arrived, cold and sudden. The footprints, the visits, the questions, the interest in the land, all of it connected somehow. She couldn't yet see the full picture, but she could feel it, the same way she could feel a storm before rain arrived. Something was coming, something hidden, and standing between her, and it was a dog who had spent 5 years watching the swamp more carefully than anyone else. For the first time since Walter died, Evelyn found herself wondering whether Duke understood the danger before she did. The relatives eventually retreated, not openly rejected, not invited inside either. Their smiles never fully returned. Their conversation remained strained. And when they finally drove away, the clearing felt noticeably quieter. Duke stayed where he was, at the foot of the porch, watching the road until the last vehicle vanished. Only then did he relax. Only then did he return to Evelyn's side. The title to the swamp sat safely inside her desk drawer. The garden stood healthy and strong. Life should have felt secure. Instead, as evening shadows stretched across the wetlands, Evelyn sensed that the real story was only beginning. And somewhere beyond the trees, beyond the abandoned shack, beyond the mystery, Duke had guarded for 5 years. Answers were waiting. She didn't sleep much that night. The image kept returning. Duke standing in front of the porch, not barking, not threatening, simply refusing to let Walter's relatives come any closer. The behavior felt different from anything she had seen before. Over the years, Duke had warned her about snakes hidden beneath tall grass. He had alerted her to approaching storms long before clouds appeared. He had even once stood between her and an aggressive wild hog until she reached safety. But this had been different. Personal, intentional, as though he recognized something she didn't. The next morning dawned cool and gray. A blanket of fog drifted low across the swamp. The gardens disappeared beneath the mist. Even the cypress trees looked ghostly. Evelyn stood on the porch with a cup of coffee. Duke sat beside her, watching, always watching. The western section, the shack, the place he had never trusted. For 5 years she had respected his instincts. For 5 years she had allowed the mystery to remain untouched. Now she wasn't sure she could do that anymore. By noon she made her decision. If someone was searching the property, if Walter's family had suddenly become interested in land they once considered worthless, then she needed answers, not next month, not next year. Today, she packed carefully, flashlight, work gloves, water, a small pry bar. Nothing dramatic, just enough to investigate safely. When she stepped off the porch, Duke immediately stood. The dog seemed to understand where she was going. For a moment he hesitated, then followed. The trail west felt different than usual. The air carried the scent of wet earth and decaying leaves. Birds called from somewhere high in the trees. Water moved quietly through hidden channels. The swamp remained beautiful. Yet beneath that beauty sat a growing tension, as though the land itself were waiting. The abandoned shack appeared slowly through the vegetation. 5 years of weather had not improved its condition. The roof sagged dangerously. Vines covered most of the walls. Sections of wood had turned silver gray with age. Up close it looked even older than she remembered. Duke stopped several yards away. The same distance he always chose. The same invisible boundary. His ears remained forward, his eyes fixed on the structure. Evelyn noticed something immediately. The brush surrounding the shack had been disturbed recently. Several branches appeared broken, freshly broken. Leaves still green, not old damage, not storm damage, recent. Someone had definitely been here. Her pulse quickened. She climbed the small porch carefully. The boards groaned beneath her weight. One step, then another. The front door hung crooked on rusted hinges. A section of chain dangled uselessly from the frame. Inside, dust coated everything. The room smelled of mildew and damp wood. Sunlight filtered through gaps in the walls. For several moments she simply looked around. An old table, collapsed shelves, broken crates. Nothing remarkable, nothing valuable. Certainly nothing worth 5 years of mystery. Yet Duke remained outside, watching, waiting, as if she hadn't reached the important part yet. Evelyn moved slowly through the shack. The floor creaked beneath every step. Near the back wall, she found evidence of recent activity. Dust had been disturbed. Not everywhere. Only in one area, a narrow section near the center of the room. She crouched, studied the floorboards. At first, she saw nothing unusual. Then she noticed slight differences in the wood. One board sat higher than the others, only by a fraction. Enough to catch her attention. She reached for the pry bar. The wood resisted, then shifted. A hollow sound echoed beneath the floor. Evelyn froze. The noise immediately changed everything. This wasn't ordinary flooring. There was space below. She worked carefully. Several more boards loosened. Dust filled the air. Her hands trembled slightly, not from fear, from anticipation. Beneath the floor sat a narrow compartment, hidden, deliberately concealed. Inside rested a metal container, dark with age, about the size of a briefcase, protected from moisture by layers of waxed cloth that had somehow survived the decades. For several seconds, Evelyn simply stared. The box looked impossibly out of place, as though somebody had hidden it and expected to return. Then never did. She lifted it carefully. The metal felt surprisingly heavy. The latch had rusted, yet not completely. After several attempts it opened. Inside lay stacks of documents, maps, photographs, survey papers, letters, everything remarkably preserved. The first photograph showed several wooden buildings standing where only swamp existed now. Men posed beside equipment. Women stood on porches. Children gathered near a water tower. A settlement, a real settlement. The forgotten community Mr. Delacroix had mentioned. Evelyn turned page after page. Property surveys, engineering sketches, land records, most dated nearly a century earlier. The deeper she looked, the stranger things became. Several documents repeatedly referenced underground water studies, test wells, flow measurements, aquifer reports. At first she didn't fully understand their significance. Then she found a folded map, large, detailed, covered in handwritten notes. One section had been marked repeatedly. The exact location matched her property. Not the gardens, not the trailer, the swamp itself. A note attached to the map caught her eye. She read it twice, then a third time. The document described an unusually large freshwater aquifer beneath the wetlands, a significant underground water source, rare, valuable, protected. The words sent a chill through her. Suddenly the pieces began connecting. The footprints, the broken chain, the recent visitors, Walter's relatives, the sudden interest in a property they had ignored for 5 years. This wasn't about reconciliation. It wasn't about family. Someone knew, or suspected. Rumors must have surfaced. Information must have leaked. Somehow people had learned there was something hidden beneath the swamp. Not gold, not treasure. Something far more valuable in modern Louisiana. Fresh water. The realization settled heavily across the room. For a long moment Evelyn sat silently among the dust and scattered papers, listening to distant birds, listening to the wind moving through broken boards, listening to her own heartbeat. Outside, Duke remained exactly where he had always remained, watching, guarding, patient, the same way he had done for years. Suddenly his behavior made more sense than ever. Not because he understood legal documents, not because he knew anything about aquifers, but because he had recognized something important. Activity, interest, people returning again and again. Something around this place had never felt right to him, and he had never stopped paying attention. Evelyn gathered the documents carefully. Every map, every survey, every photograph. The container itself, nothing would remain behind. As she stepped outside, sunlight broke through the clouds. The swamp stretched before her, quiet, beautiful, deceptively ordinary. 5 years ago, everyone had seen worthless land. 5 years later, people were coming back. And now she finally understood why. Duke walked beside her as they headed home. For the first time in years, he glanced back only once, toward the shack. Toward the place he had watched for so long. The mystery wasn't over, not yet, but the first real answer had finally been found, and it changed everything. The metal container sat on Evelyn's kitchen table. Maps, survey records, photographs, letters. 5 years earlier, she would have felt overwhelmed by it all. Now she felt something else. Focus. Outside, evening settled over the wetlands. The last sunlight reflected across the water. Tree frogs had begun their nightly chorus. Duke lay beneath the table, his head resting on his paws. Close enough to touch, close enough to remind her she wasn't facing any of this alone. For 2 days Evelyn sorted through the documents. Carefully, methodically. The way Walter used to organize tax records every winter. Every paper seemed connected to another. One map led to a survey. A survey led to a report. A report referenced letters written decades earlier. Piece by piece, the picture became clearer. The forgotten settlement had depended on the freshwater aquifer. Engineers had documented it. Surveyors had mapped it. Property owners had protected information about it. Then the flood came. The settlement disappeared. Records were lost. Knowledge faded. Generations passed, and eventually the swamp became just another forgotten tract of land. Or so everyone believed. Evelyn stared at one particular document longer than the others. A survey completed nearly 80 years earlier. The boundaries matched her property exactly. Every acre, every channel, every ridge. The land had never been worthless. People had simply stopped understanding its value. A truck engine interrupted her thoughts. She looked through the window. A vehicle sat near the produce stand. Curtis, again. This time he wasn't smiling when he climbed out. He looked tired, older, worried. Evelyn stepped onto the porch. Duke followed. The German shepherd remained calm, alert, watching. Curtis stopped several feet away. Neither spoke immediately. The silence felt different now. The friendliness was gone. The performance exhausted. Finally, Curtis sighed. "Looks like you've done pretty well for yourself." Evelyn said nothing. He glanced toward the gardens, the wetlands, the trailer, everything she had built. Then his eyes returned to her. "We should talk." The words sounded familiar, dangerously familiar. 5 years earlier, people had wanted to talk then too, about property, about decisions, about what was supposedly best for everyone. Evelyn remained where she was. What about? Curtis hesitated. For the first time she saw uncertainty, real uncertainty, not calculation, not confidence, fear. The realization surprised her. We've heard some things. There it was. Not family, not reconciliation things. Rumors, information. Exactly as she suspected. What kind of things, she asked. Curtis shifted uncomfortably. About the land. The answer hung between them. Simple. Honest. Finally. Duke remained motionless beside the porch. Watching. Listening. Curtis looked at the dog briefly before continuing. There are people asking questions. What people? Investors, developers, water companies. Evelyn felt no surprise, only confirmation. The rumors had spread farther than she realized. Far enough to attract attention. Far enough to bring people back. Curtis rubbed the back of his neck. You need to understand something. His voice softened. Things haven't been easy. The statement sounded carefully chosen. Yet there was truth behind it. Evelyn knew enough about the parish to understand what Harold had implied months earlier. Several businesses had failed, investments collapsed, property values shifted. People who once felt secure no longer did. The family that had divided Walter's estate had not escaped those troubles. And suddenly the swamp looked different. Very different. Curtis looked toward the wetlands. You ever wonder why everyone came back? Evelyn almost laughed, not because it was funny, because the answer now seemed obvious. No, she said quietly. I think I know. The words landed harder than any accusation. Curtis lowered his eyes. For a moment he looked like a man carrying something heavy, not guilt exactly. Something close, regret perhaps, or embarrassment. The difference hardly mattered. The truth mattered. And the truth was finally standing in the open. The visits, the pie, the conversations, the sudden concern. None of it had been about her. It had been about the property, about possibility, about value, about opportunity. The same opportunity nobody recognized when she was handed 12 acres of swamp and sent away. Curtis sat heavily on the edge of a bench. For the first time since arriving, he seemed tired of pretending. We heard rumors months ago. There it was. The sentence she had been waiting for. Rumors about what? Old records, water rights, survey documents. His shoulders sagged. Nobody knew if it was true. Evelyn thought about the broken chain, the footprints, the disturbed brush. Someone had been looking, searching, trying to find evidence before she did. Not necessarily to steal it, but to confirm it, to gain leverage, to gain knowledge, to gain advantage. The realization reopened an old wound, not because of the land, because of what it revealed. 5 years earlier they had looked at her and seen a burden attached to worthless property. Now they looked at her and saw possibility. The contrast hurt more than she expected, not because she wanted their approval, because she finally understood how little their judgment had ever been worth. The feeling surprised her. She expected anger. Instead, she felt clarity, a calm she hadn't known was possible. The swamp had changed her. The years had changed her. The woman who arrived with a trailer full of grief and nowhere else to go might have argued, might have demanded apologies, might have tried to prove something. That woman no longer existed. The wetlands had taught patience, work, persistence, not through words, through experience. Curtis looked up. What happens now? The question carried more weight than he realized, because it wasn't really about documents, or water, or property. It was about control. 5 years ago, others made decisions for her. Now they couldn't. The difference changed everything. Evelyn looked across the wetlands. The sunset painted the water gold. Birds crossed the horizon. Duke sat quietly beside the porch. The same dog who had watched the shack. The same dog who blocked the door. The same dog who sensed something was wrong long before she understood it herself. What happens now? The answer arrived easily, because for the first time since Walter died, she wasn't afraid of it. Now, she said calmly, I decide what happens next. Curtis lowered his gaze. Neither argued, neither needed to. The conversation ended a few minutes later. No raised voices, no dramatic confrontation, just truth. When Curtis finally walked back toward his truck, he seemed smaller somehow, not physically, emotionally, like a man who had spent years chasing the wrong thing. Evelyn watched him leave. Then she looked down at Duke. The German shepherd's eyes followed the truck until it disappeared. Only then did he relax. The mystery was nearly solved. The motives were no longer hidden. And for the first time, Evelyn understood that the greatest change had not happened beneath the swamp. It had happened within her. The land had value. That was true. The aquifer mattered. The records mattered. The future mattered. But none of those things explained why she felt stronger standing on that porch than she ever had standing in the old farmhouse. The answer was simpler. 5 years ago, she had been discarded along with the property. Now she understood that neither of them had ever been worthless, and no one else's opinion could change that again. The weeks that followed moved more quietly than Evelyn expected. There were no dramatic confrontations, no shouting matches, no legal threats delivered in the middle of the night. Real life rarely unfolded that way. Instead, there were meetings, phone calls, paperwork, long conversations with attorneys, surveyors, and county officials. The documents from the metal container proved authentic. Every map, every survey, every record. Experts examined them carefully. The conclusions remained consistent. The forgotten settlement had existed. The aquifer was real, and the property rights connected to that aquifer belonged entirely to Evelyn Carter. The confirmation arrived on a cool November morning. A thick envelope rested inside her mailbox. The official documents felt surprisingly ordinary. Just paper, ink, signatures. Yet they carried the weight of decades. Evelyn sat at her kitchen table reading every page while Duke rested nearby. Sunlight filtered through the window. Outside, the wetlands shimmered beneath a pale autumn sky. When she finished, she placed the papers neatly back into the envelope. Then she simply sat there, quiet, not celebrating, not crying, just breathing, because something that had remained uncertain for years was finally settled. The land was hers. The future was hers. The decisions were hers. A few days later, Curtis returned. This time he came alone. No convoy. No carefully planned family visit. No rehearsed smiles. Just Curtis, older, tired, and noticeably humbler than before. Evelyn invited him onto the porch. For the first time in years, Duke did not step between them. The dog remained beside her chair, watching, calm. The difference did not escape Evelyn. Neither of them mentioned it. For several minutes, they listened to the sounds of the swamp. Wind moving through reeds, birds calling from distant trees, water shifting through hidden channels. Finally, Curtis spoke. The lawyers explained everything. Evelyn nodded. Neither needed to discuss the details. The facts were already established. Curtis looked across the wetlands. It's strange. What is? He laughed softly. We all thought this place was useless. The honesty surprised her, because it wasn't an excuse, it wasn't a defense, it was simply the truth. The family had looked at 12 acres of swamp and seen a problem. Nothing more. For a while neither spoke. Then Curtis looked toward the gardens, the produce stand, the beehives, the trails, everything she had built. You turned it into something. Evelyn smiled. No. Curtis looked confused. She gestured toward the wetlands. It was already something. The wind stirred the marsh grass. Sunlight danced across the water. The swamp seemed to stretch endlessly beyond the trees. Beautiful, alive, exactly as it had always been. People simply hadn't noticed. Curtis lowered his eyes. After a while he stood. The conversation had reached its natural end. Neither offered apologies. Neither demanded them. Some things did not require additional words. As he walked back toward his truck, Curtis stopped once. I hope things go well for you. This time the sentiment felt genuine. Evelyn believed he meant it. Thank you. Then he left, and that chapter of her life quietly closed behind him. Winter settled gently across the wetlands. Morning fog became more frequent. The gardens slowed. Migrating birds arrived in great numbers. The swamp felt peaceful. For the first time in years, no unanswered questions remained. The shack had revealed its secrets. The footprints had been explained. The family's sudden return finally made sense. Even Duke seemed different, lighter somehow. He still watched the western section occasionally. Old habits remained. But the constant vigilance had softened. The invisible burden he had carried for years appeared finally gone. One afternoon, representatives from a regional conservation group visited the property. They had learned about the aquifer, about the wetlands, about the historical records. Their proposal surprised her. Rather than exploiting the land for short-term profit, they wanted to help protect it, preserve the wetlands, study the history of the forgotten settlement, create educational opportunities for local schools and community groups. Evelyn listened carefully. Then she agreed, not because it profitable, because it felt right. The swamp had given her a second life. She wanted it protected, respected, understood. Over the following months, partnerships formed. Researchers documented the old settlement. Students visited the property. Local families explored walking trails created along the ridge. The wetlands became something few people imagined possible. A place of learning, a place of history, a place of community. And through it all, Evelyn remained exactly where she wanted to be, at home. One evening in early spring, nearly 6 years after she first arrived, she carried a cup of coffee onto the porch. The sun was beginning to set. Orange light stretched across the water. A pair of herons crossed the horizon. The air smelled faintly of wildflowers and damp earth. Duke followed and settled beside her chair. His muzzle was almost completely gray now, his movements slower, yet his eyes remained the same. Steady, wise, loyal. Evelyn reached down and rested a hand on his neck. The dog leaned gently against her leg. The familiar gesture brought a smile to her face. Together they watched the sun sink lower. The wetlands glowed gold. The channels reflected the sky. Everywhere she looked, life moved quietly through the swamp. Fish beneath the water, birds among the trees, wind across the reeds. The same place that once arrived wrapped in humiliation and loss. The same place everyone else dismissed. The same place that had changed everything. Her eyes drifted toward the distant western section, toward the trees hiding the old shack, toward the place where the mystery began. For years she believed Duke had been guarding a structure, or a secret, or hidden documents. Now she understood something different. The dog had been guarding her. Every warning, every watchful glance, every silent patrol. He had recognized what she couldn't see. That not everyone who returned came back for the right reasons. That some dangers arrived smiling. That instincts often notice what evidence has not yet revealed. The realization filled her with quiet gratitude. The sun touched the horizon. Golden light softened. Shadows lengthened across the wetlands. Evelyn looked around one last time. The gardens, the water, the trees. The place she once believed was a punishment. The place that became a home. And she finally understood something the years had patiently taught her. People often judge worth by what they see first. A swamp, an old dog, a widow with nowhere else to go. But appearances have a way of hiding the truth. Sometimes the things others dismiss hold value beyond measure. Sometimes opportunities arrive disguised as burdens. And sometimes the companions who stand beside us in our hardest seasons see dangers and possibilities long before we do. The evening breeze moved gently across the porch. Duke rested his head against her boot. The wetlands shimmered beneath the fading light. And as darkness slowly settled across the swamp, Evelyn Carter felt something she had not felt on the day she received that deed. Not relief, not victory. Peace, a deep, steady peace earned one day at a time. The door that mattered had never been the one on the old shack. It was the one she finally opened within herself. And unlike the others, that door would never need to be closed again. It was the one she finally opened within herself. And unlike the others, that door would never need to be closed again. The sun slipped lower across the swamp, turning the water into liquid gold. Evelyn sat quietly, her hand resting on Duke's graying neck. Out beyond the reeds, hidden behind years of vines and silence, stood the old shack that had changed everything. Not because of what was buried beneath its floor, because of what it revealed. 5 years earlier, she had arrived believing she'd been sent away with the leftovers. A piece of land nobody wanted, a future nobody envied. But the swamp had never rejected her. People had, and somehow, a dog understood that long before she did. Duke never cared about deeds or survey maps. He never knew there was an aquifer beneath the water or documents beneath the floorboards. What he knew was simpler. Something wasn't right, so he watched, day after day, year after year. When everyone else forgot about that corner of the property, he remembered.
When people came back smiling, he stood in the doorway, and when Evelyn finally needed the tool, he led her back to it. The evening breeze stirred the stone rash. Duck sighed and leaned a little closer. Evelyn looked around the wetland one last time and realized the most valuable thing she found out. There wasn't hidden underground. It was the certainty that being overlooked is not the same thing as being worthless. A lot of people know that feeling, the job that passed them by, the family that stopped calling, the chapter of life that seemed to close before they were ready. Sometimes all it takes is one person or one loyalty dog to keep believing there's something worth protecting until you can see it for yourself. As darkness settled over the water, Evelyn smiled and reached behind Doc's ears. Then she whispered the question she wished she could ask him. What was it you saw on those years that I didn't?